A wooden canoe bobbed up and down on deep blue ocean water. Inside sat a man, a woman, and a young boy. The man and the boy held paddles and intermittently pushed them through the warm water. Half a kilometer to their south, mountains rose up from the beach, and if they stopped paddling completely, the current would carry them away from where they were camped on that island. In the middle of the canoe, the woman held a roll of thin string, at the end of which was tied a stone weight and a white hook, made from a shiny piece of seashell. This type of fishing gear required no bait. The luster of the hook was enticing enough. This family had already been out on the water for an hour, and several fish were lying at their feet. The sun was rising higher, a sign that they should head back to the shore to escape the midday heat. But just as the woman was pulling in another fish, a tuna about as long as her arm, the man spotted another canoe on the horizon, much further out at sea. As the boy helped his mother remove the hook from the mouth of the fish, they decided to wait to greet these outsiders. After several minutes, the faces of 5 people became visible. A yelp of surprise escaped the man's mouth when he recognized his cousin paddling at the front of the approaching boat. These voyagers had come all the way from the neighboring island, about 30 kilometers away, where the fisherman had been born and raised, and where his extended family still lived. He had only moved to this island a few years earlier, when he had become part of his wife's clan. Amid joyful greetings and with a few adept paddles, the canoes sidled up against each other. It turned out that this group had left their home island at dawn and made good time crossing the deep waters of the ocean channel. They knew that they could count on a warm welcome, given their many personal connections to the community on this island. The 2 groups began paddling back to the beach together, where they would join the rest of the family's band and eat fish. This family lived 14,000 years ago on the island of Timor in Southeast Asia. We don't know if canoes had been invented by this time, but we do know that a culture of adept seafarers and fishers flourished in the south of the Wallacean archipelago, and that inter-island voyages were a common affair. Welcome to Our Prehistory, Episode 39, Terminal Pleistocene of Southeast Asia. The millennia that followed the last glacial maximum was a time of change for our species. In northern Eurasia, the cultures of the Ice Age were transforming into something different, technologically, ideologically, and demographically. Momentous events took place, like the origin of pottery in East Asia and the replacement of Magdalenian culture in Western Europe by migrants from the southeast. In New Guinea, the highlands were colonized by people who practiced innovative broad-spectrum foraging, setting the stage for the emergence of agriculture, while in Australia, the centrality of humans in rock art and the appearance of cemeteries marked brand new types of symbolic behavior, hinting at shifts in the nature of social relationships. Unlike anything seen in older cultures, These developments foreshadowed the direction of cultural evolution during the Holocene. But what about the tropics of Asia? Did a similar prehistoric inflection point occur there? Unlike in the north, the types of stone tools used by people in South and Southeast Asia remained the same throughout this period, even though the planet was experiencing substantial warming and a drastic reorganization of its biomes. But stone tools don't tell the whole story. When we look at other types of evidence, signs of change appear within hunter-gatherer societies in Sri Lanka, mainland Southeast Asia, and the islands of Wallacea. Perhaps this transformation wasn't as dramatic as in the north, but as we will see today, environmental change in tropical Asia coincided with shifting approaches to the exploitation of natural resources, new forms of symbolism, and large-scale human migrations. The terminal Pleistocene, the period from 19,000 to 11,700 years ago, from the end of the last glacial maximum to the start of the Holocene, witnessed a rise in global temperatures. Southeast Asia warmed by 4 degrees Celsius. This, along with more rainfall, resulted in the expansion of tropical forest into areas previously covered by grassy savanna. By the early Holocene, this entire region would be essentially completely covered by trees. Importantly, the exact timing of climate change doesn't match that in northern Eurasia. Whereas the most dramatic increase in temperatures occurred 14,700 years ago in Europe and northern Asia, it arrived sooner in Southeast Asia. By 16,000 years ago, precipitation intensified substantially as the monsoon system became more active, bringing more moisture from the Indian Ocean onto land. Evidence for this approximate date shows up in several different records. Stalactites and stalagmites in caves on the mainland of Southeast Asia reveal a shift in oxygen isotopes, indicative of increased rainfall 16,000 years ago. Carbon isotopes in guano deposits in southern Borneo show that by 17,000 years ago, a closed tropical forest had formed around a cave previously surrounded by savanna. In southern India, woodlands replaced grassland by 15,000 years ago, based on the appearance of bones belonging to forest-dwelling species of deer and pig. Finally, around 16,000 years ago, ostriches, an animal adapted to dry grassland, disappeared permanently from the Indian subcontinent. The impact of this environmental transformation on hunter-gatherers must have been significant. Many bands of people whose ancestors' way of life had depended on access to grassland resources now had to adapt to a forest-centered existence. Rainforest specialists had inhabited parts of Southeast Asia continuously for tens of thousands of years, but by the start of the Holocene, many more groups were forced to adopt this lifeway. Yet, surprisingly, archaeological evidence of this adaptation is hard to find. People did not invent new types of stone tools to cope with the spread of forests. But in some cases, they did place greater emphasis on certain pre-existing types of tools. For example, in both Sri Lanka and northern Borneo, early centers of rainforest occupation, people ramped up their production of bone tools, especially bone points, a type of tool that begins appearing for the first time in other parts of Southeast Asia, including Java, Vietnam, and peninsular Malaysia. This trend likely represents a technological adjustment made as people altered their strategies for hunting and fishing. Maybe they used bows and arrows tipped with bone points more frequently to hunt arboreal animals. Another shift in forager toolkits during the terminal Pleistocene can be seen on the mainland of Southeast Asia, where the use of Hoa Binhian stone tools became more common. Axe-like Sumatralis, the classic Hoa Binhian tools, are theorized to have been used to chop and shape wood, a material which became more abundant as forest expanded. One place where a shift in the use of resources can be clearly seen is in the rainforests of Sri Lanka. Here, one rock shelter known as Batadomba Lena harbors an exceptionally long record of human activity, which shows that around 16,000 years ago, people began spending more and more time there, making large fire pits, digging post holes for structures, and making earthen ovens. This intensive form of occupation contrasts starkly with the short-lived visits made over the previous 20,000 years. As the characteristics of the rainforest were changing during the terminal Pleistocene, so did the mobility and foraging of people in Sri Lanka. They started spending more time in single locations and exploiting the plants and animals of this ecosystem differently. While monkeys remained their most hunted animal, smaller prey began to constitute a larger proportion of their diet, including squirrels, mongooses, lizards, snakes, fishes, and snails. Furthermore, people at Batadomba Lena began collecting and eating canarium nuts more frequently. Anvil stones used to crush these nuts also increase in number around 16,000 years ago. In essence, what had already been a broad diet was becoming even more diverse. People were utilizing second and third choice food options more frequently than before, a fact which fits well with longer periods of habitation at the rock shelter. By exploiting a wider variety of resources in the nearby forest, they didn't exhaust any particular food as quickly, and didn't have to move to a new camp. We don't know if this change in behavior was one born out of necessity or opportunity. They might have been forced to hunt more squirrels, lizards, and snakes, and gather more snails and nuts because of a growing human population and shrinking foraging areas. Alternatively, maybe canarium trees and certain small animals had become more numerous and easier to access, making moving to a new camp less urgent. Either way, Batadomba Lena shows a clear example of people adjusting as the climate warmed and Sri Lankan ecosystems changed. In other parts of the world, hunter-gatherers living at the same time underwent a similar broadening of their diet in the face of a growing human population. In southern Europe, people hunted small animals more often, and in East Asia, they used aquatic and plant foods more frequently. Transformations of tropical and temperate biomes during the terminal Pleistocene altered what humans ate, a prelude to much more radical dietary changes that came later. Along with the increasing dominance of forests, another major natural phenomenon impacted the people of Southeast Asia after the last glacial maximum: the flooding of the Sunda Peninsula. As temperatures rose and large ice sheets in the northern hemisphere melted, sea levels rose. Between 19,000 and 11,000 years ago, ocean water encroached on this southern tip of Asia, eventually covering 75% of its landmass, and leaving behind the islands of Borneo, Java, and Sumatra. This large-scale loss of land drove people to migrate into an increasingly forested and small area. Unfortunately, we know little about the story of these refugees from Sunda. The remains of many of their camps are now underwater, and the above-water archaeological record on the surviving islands is limited. But there are 2 places in Southeast Asia where evidence of substantial cultural change during the terminal Pleistocene exists, and neither was part of the shrinking Sunda Peninsula. These locations are the southern islands of Wallacea and the northern portion of the Southeast Asian mainland, areas which we will explore in the remainder of this episode, beginning with the mainland. Besides the fact that people within the Hoa Binhan region were increasingly using bone points and heavy-duty Sumatralists, another more significant transformation was occurring. This cultural process was focused on a large area running from the Himalayan foothills of Myanmar eastward to the lowlands around the Yangtze River of southern China. Oriented on an east-west axis, this stretch of land served as a key prehistoric crossroads, likely the route taken by exploring bands of Homo sapiens during the initial colonization of Asia, as they dispersed from the Indian subcontinent to East Asia. Much more accessible than the Himalayas to the north, this Southeast Asian corridor through the foothills remained central to human movements, and during the terminal Pleistocene, new customs spread widely across it. One of these was the appearance of formal burials, a practice essentially undocumented in Southeast Asia before the last glacial maximum. At least 20 graves at 7 sites in northern Vietnam and Thailand and southern China have been discovered and dated to between 16,000 and 12,000 years ago. The emergence of human burial at this time parallels similar trends in southern Australia and Italy, perhaps spurred by growing human populations and more complex social dynamics. The bodies in these graves exhibited a variety of positions, some laid on their back, others on their side, but archaeologists have noticed that most had bent legs. So-called flexed burials also appear further south during the terminal Pleistocene, at single sites in peninsular Malaysia, Java, Borneo, and southern Wallacea. This burial pose seems to be primarily associated with hunter-gatherers in Southeast Asia. Once farmers arrived during the Holocene, extended legs became more common. With the exception of leg position, Hoa Binhan rituals surrounding death varied substantially, as seen in the quantity and types of items placed in graves with the deceased. Some people left no grave goods at all. Others did so generously. Some bodies had ochre powder sprinkled over them, a custom also followed in Europe and Australia during the Pleistocene. Others were accompanied by animal bones, mollusk shells, smooth cobbles, or used hammerstones. At a few sites, large slabs or blocks of stone marked the graves at ground level. This variability suggests that funerary customs were not governed by strict conventions in the Hoa Binhan world. Contemporaneous burials in Italy, on the other hand, followed a relatively standard body position and set of grave goods. A rock shelter called Doi Pha Khan in the mountains of northern Thailand produced some of the richest graves of the terminal Pleistocene. Here, 3 men were buried with flexed limbs between 15,500 and 13,000 years ago. Red ochre powder, large mortars and pestles used to grind the ochre, stone tools, a shell pendant, a tortoise shell, and bones of tiny muntjac deer all accompanied the bodies, suggesting an elaborate ritual. But another type of item left in 2 of these graves has revealed the existence of another tradition, which was spreading through the east-west corridor of Southeast Asia. These were heavy, perforated stones, shaped like large donuts, about 15 centimeters wide, with a wide hole drilled through their center. Given its large size, most archaeologists believe this type of artifact had a practical function, possibly as a weight for fishing nets, digging sticks, or club heads. Another theory suggests that they were spindle whorls for making string. Whatever their function, perforated stones were a successful technological innovation, adopted by forager bands over a wide area. Found in the Himalayan foothills of Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, and the lowlands of southern China, this tool was used from about 19,000 until 6,000 years ago. The oldest known perforated stones come from southern China, possibly their center of origin. It's worth noting that similar stones were made by the first pottery-making peoples of the Amur River basin in northern China and Far East Russia, who formed vibrant fishing societies. The overlap between the area where people began using perforated stones and performing formal burials hints at the emergence and spread of a new culture across this Southeast Asian corridor, possibly initiated by a large-scale migration. Support for this theory can be found in the DNA of living people. Genetic similarities have been identified in the people of southern China, Southeast Asia, and eastern India. This genetic signal is often only observable in ethnic minorities, and scientists believe that it resulted from a significant movement of people originating in China during the Pleistocene and passing through mainland Southeast Asia and arriving at the Indian subcontinent. One study estimates that this migration occurred more than 22,000 years ago, whereas others place it closer to 16,000 years ago, around the time that burials and perforated stones appear in Thailand. Uncertainty comes with any genetic dating of demographic events when using information only from modern individuals. But it's safe to conclude that large groups of hunter-gatherers moved across the Himalayan foothills of Southeast Asia, either during the terminal Pleistocene or the last glacial maximum, perhaps prompted by climatic fluctuations of these periods. Migration might not necessarily explain the spread of perforated stones and burials, but both these events are important reminders that human populations of the Paleolithic were not static. As we have seen in Europe and Northern Asia, groups of people moved around, replacing or mixing with local inhabitants, and transmitting their unique genetic lineages and traditions. Even though Hoabinhian peoples maintained continuity in most of their stone tools throughout the terminal Pleistocene, their cultures were dynamic. Some groups even decided to permanently move away from the lands occupied by their ancestors. Around the same time that bands of hunter-gatherers were migrating across the Himalayan foothills, a similar event was taking place more than 3,000 kilometers to the southeast, where large numbers of sea-bound travelers, set off from the western coast of New Guinea and settled on many of the small islands they encountered in Wallacea. Over time, they mixed with the locals, who were probably quite culturally and linguistically distinct. Evidence of this migration appears, once again, in the DNA of modern-day people, which reveals that groups belonging to Papuan and Wallacean ancestries intermingled around 15,000 years ago. Demographic turmoil characterized the terminal Pleistocene of Southeast Asia. As the climate warmed and sea levels rose, certain ethnic groups expanded into areas occupied by others. Identifying the cause, describing the extent, and finding archaeological signs of this migration is difficult. Some notable cultural novelties did emerge during this period, but their connection to the arrival of people from New Guinea is unclear. For example, Datu Saman rock art appeared just west of Wallacea in Borneo at some point before 13,600 years ago, while the remarkably similar Guion paintings emerged just south of Wallacea in Australia around 12,700 years ago. The striking similarity of these styles, which both depict thin-bodied humans wearing large headdresses, support the idea that new symbolic themes and ideologies were spreading across large distances, raising the question of the relationship between this rock art and the migration through Wallacea. Further proof that human movement between islands became increasingly frequent during the terminal Pleistocene comes from archaeological remains on the islands of southern Wallacea. Around 16,000 years ago, 4 islands became part of a maritime social network through which people traded goods and shared ideas. The communities of Timor and 3 smaller islands remained in regular contact by crossing ocean channels of around 30 kilometers. On all 4 islands, obsidian originating from a 5th unidentified island was found among camp refuse, showing that people had begun transporting this valuable black stone by boat. Growing contact between islands accompanied a wider social transformation, which included the spread of new technologies. On 3 of these islands, carefully carved fishhooks made from seashells had been discovered and dated to the terminal Pleistocene. They came in 2 varieties, J-shaped and U-shaped. The U-shaped hooks, also called rotating hooks, were about 5 centimeters long and designed to catch larger fish further offshore than J-shaped hooks, which were only about 3 centimeters long. This specialized fishing gear allowed anglers to catch fish in different zones of the ocean. At one site, a woman was buried along with several rotating fishhooks, demonstrating the importance of fishing in this culture. Abundant remains of fish, crabs, mollusks, and sea urchins have been found at their coastal camps, including species that live in coral reefs, like parrotfish, and in deeper waters, like tuna. Within this maritime network, the sharing of ideas also led to uniformity of symbolic practices. A specific style of oval-shaped bead with 2 holes appears on all 4 islands beginning 14,000 years ago. These were tiny, ranging from half a centimeter to 1 centimeter long, and exclusively made from the shell of nautilus, a relative of octopus and squid. These double-holed nautilus beads have been found at sites 300 kilometers apart, demonstrating the geographic extent of this culture. Markings on these artifacts suggest that they were sewn into fabric as sequins, a new type of personal ornamentation in this part of the world. They are reminiscent of double-holed ivory sequins used by Oregon nations in southern Germany. Standardization in bead form in Wallacea hints at growing complexity, requiring new symbolic practices to mediate social relationships. Obsidian, fishhooks, and double-holed nautilus beads reveal the formation of an inter-island social network and a new culture in southern Wallacea. But many questions remain. Why did people begin traveling by sea more often at that time? What was the relationship between growing maritime connections and the migrants arriving from New Guinea? Did some technological advance improve the construction of boats or navigation across the ocean? Did environmental change incentivize people to exploit marine resources more intensively? We don't yet know the answers to any of these questions, and we can only speculate about the potential role of population growth, the flooding of Sunda and Sahul, and the expansion of tropical forests on these demographic and cultural changes. From 19,000 to 11,700 years ago, mild to major cultural changes appeared across Southeast Asia, from the broadening of the economy in Sri Lanka to the spread of new customs in Thailand and Wallacea. Perforated stones, formal burials, Datu Saman rock art, specialized fishhooks, and double-holed nautilus beads were all innovations hinting at changing approaches to obtaining food and shifting forms of social organization. This was also a time of large population movements, not unlike those in Europe and Northeast Asia. However, unlike dispersals in temperate locations, which tended to be movements of people northward during this period of global warming, in tropical Asia, two separate migrations went from east to west. These were migratory back waves going in the opposite direction of the initial colonization of these regions by Homo sapiens. We don't have enough information to understand the forces driving these migrations, but logic would suggest that southern China and New Guinea, the origins of these back waves, experienced high rates of human population growth during the terminal Pleistocene. Encounters between ethnically distinct groups likely resulted in the spread of new behaviors, technologies, and beliefs. Demographic and cultural changes in Southeast Asia might not have been as dramatic as those further north, but clearly, the Ice Age cultures of the tropics were gradually being reshaped into forms more suitable to a warmer, wetter, more forested world. In our next episode, we move on to a new continent and decipher the arrival of Homo sapiens in America. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of the show. Your support will allow me to continue bringing you our prehistory.